The 19th century, the age of steam. All over the world, iron roads were stretching across the continents. In America, the immigrants flowing west had a comfortable train journey instead of months in a covered wagon. In New Zealand also, the iron roads were opening up new areas for settlement. This is the story of the Wellington-Manawatu Railway and the changes it brought to the Wellington region in the 1880s. These changes were rapid, but they were permanent. It was the railway that created the landscape we know today. By 1880, you could travel by train through the Wairarapa. The station owners had persuaded the government to lay a line through the Rimatakas to the open, level sheep country. But Manawatu was still, to Europeans, a dreary wasteland of bush and swamp, and the Māori tribes continued in almost undisturbed possession of their land. There were no roads. If you had to travel between Wellington and Foxton, you went by coach along the beach. It wasn't a pleasant journey, 32 shillings and in sixpenny worth of misery, and crossing the rivers could be dangerous. This is how one settler remembered it.
We went along the seafront until we came to the Waikanae River, which to my horror was in flood. Some Maoris came in sight and we were ordered into their boat. I hugged my children, closed my eyes and didn't open them until we were hauled up onto the bank.
A Wellington merchant, James Wallace, during many slow and sodden journeys, thought about trains. The Wairarapa line had been a disappointment. In Wellington, business was slow and there were hundreds of unemployed. People wanted work and trade and land. The life of the district depended on breaking through the barrier of the Wellington Hills and opening up the land to the north. The tangata whenua of Manawatu and Horowhenua also saw the benefits of trade with Wellington. Some ran large flocks of sheep in the coastal dunes. The flour mills at Otaki ground wheat grown by Māori farmers, and pigs raised in Horowhenua were needed in Wellington butchers' shops. All this produce had to go down the beach or by coastal boats. Wellington businessmen became impatient with the government, said John Plimmer.
If you want a thing done well, you must do it yourself.
They called a public meeting, moved Mr. Travers
that it is essential to the interests of the city and districts lying between it and Wanganui that a line of railway should be constructed without delay between Wellington and Manawatu. That the government being unable to undertake the work, steps should be taken to construct it by private capital.
So in 1884, the Wellington and Manawatu Railway Company was formed. First, it was necessary to buy land from the Māori owners. In fact, many gave generous grants to the company. Major Kemp, a Muapoko leader, who had gained a commission in the government forces, announced,
"I am filled with delight about the proposed railway, and if I were a rich man, I would construct this part myself and hand it over in the manner of a chief."
Wirimu Parata of Waikanae promised free right of way through Atiawa land. A large meeting was held at Whakarangatai, which means listen to the voice of the tides. There he explained the good that the railway would bring and urged his people to welcome the tides of change. Soon the work on the line began. Chief Engineer Higginson had built railways in Russia and India, but even so the route was a challenge. The Johnsonville tunnels, the Belmont Viaduct, the Paikokariki Hills, the thick bush of Horowhenua, the swamps in Manawatu. Higginson decided on the inland route bypassing Foxton, then on to Palmerston North. Now hundreds of the Wellington unemployed were finding work laying the line, though it was hard and sometimes dangerous work. And as sections were opened up, there were jobs for drivers, brakemen, guards and station masters. The tides of change were swift. In November 1886, another ceremony was held near Waikanai. Trainloads of people had come from Wellington and from Palmerston North. To the cheers of the crowd and the strains of the national anthem, the last spike was driven in, and the railway was open 6 months ahead of time.
When they take the government engines off at the end of the government road, you'll hear a Baldwin's wheezy cough as they back her down to the load. Well, this is the stretch where the mail trains race for 50 miles and more, making up time which the tardy pace on the hills has lost before. They couple her on with a time-worn jest with a long-burned block bell's call. The big bull yank will do her best when they let the signal fall. You'll feel her galloping around the curves and rolling down on her springs. The cars will follow in giddying swerves like hurrying hunted things. Her black smoke tells of a fire-hard coal. They're driving her all they know, for I heard it whispered when she took hold that settled, so let her go.
The company ran a fast and efficient service, 46 trains a week. Most of the locomotives were American. The Baldwin No. 10 was famous for its record run when it hauled a special train from Wellington to Longbourn in just 2 hours and 6 minutes. The coaches offered passengers comfort, even luxury. Food for the restaurant car was taken in along the line, each station being known for its delicacies: bread rolls from Johnsonville, vegetables from Waikanai, fresh fish, eggs, poultry. No fruitcake and pies on the company line. Now, as had been hoped, the district began to open up for settlement. First came the sawmillers, and mills were built near the railway stations. They were plagued by fire, explosions and accidents, perhaps earning money to buy a farm made up for the lonely and dangerous life. Peter Bartholomew built the first mill at Levin, and some of his machinery is still in use, as described by a fascinated young settler.
Bartholomew's mill is now in full swing. The Remu logs are brought down from bush and placed on skids between tramline and mill. By means of a hand winch and chain, the logs are rolled onto a divided platform. A hand lever connects machinery, and by means of a cable, the platform is drawn towards 2 circular saws. These saws are placed vertically, one over the other, and turn in the same manner as a pair of cogwheels, towards the log. Another lever sets the saws, which are kept wet with water, in motion. The log is brought in contact with the saws, and with a loud crash, a large slab is cut off the side of the log. The slab falls onto 2 sets of horizontal rollers, and it is passed over to a single circular saw, where 2 men cut it into the required size. The sawdust from all the saws falls into a trough of flowing water and is washed clear of the building.
From Wellington, excursion trains were laid on with special fares to allow people to inspect the blocks for sale. William George Adkin wrote,
After a few miles, the bushland began to surround the track, the railway making a cutting, like a huge trench in the eternal solitude of the forest. I felt it would not be an unworthy life to clear a portion of this fertile country and make a home.
In Wellington, land sales were brisk. Town sections were sold and settlements began to grow up around the stations, and settlers in their hundreds were loading their goods on the train and making for their blocks to begin clearing the land to make a home. During all this time, in the centre of the North Island, work had continued on the main trunk railway, and finally the last spike was driven in, and Wellington and Auckland were linked by rail. The government then bought out the Wellington Manawatu Company, and the 20 locomotives and 300 staff were transferred to New Zealand Railways. The Manawatu Standard said,
This event has marked the final phase of one of the most successful enterprises this country has known.
In 22 years, the trains had transformed the district, bringing both gains and losses. The forest had gone, though in the growing prosperity, few Europeans mourned its passing. The land was cleared, pastures established, and even the wastes of the Makurua swamp were now productive dairyland. But the Maori tribes who had welcomed the railway now mourned the loss of their land. There has been disputes over ownership, legal costs were high, and they had ended up with neither land nor money. Said Mohi Rakuraku,
"The law has been our ruin. In the times of our ancestors, we have received no hurt similar to this. Give us back what land is left."
they had lost not only their traditional use of the forest and streams, but the rewards of the sheep farming and wheat growing began a generation before. It was almost a century before they regained a share in the prosperity of the district and began to profit from the new tides of change. Now meeting houses are being restored by local families, and there is a feeling of confidence in the future. The tides of change in New Zealand farming are bringing changes to the landscape of Horowhenua and Manawatu, but the railway line is still busy, like the roads that followed it and the towns that grew up by the stations. That pattern of settlement, the prosperity of the district and the loss of the forest are the permanent marks of the 22 years of the Wellington and Manawatu Railway Company. To mark its centenary, thousands of people once again travelled the Iron Road. Few would be thinking of gains or losses. Like their forebears, they were celebrating the power and energy of the age of steam.
Let her go. When they run the government engines back to their work on the government road, a Baldwin splutters along the track to be coupled onto the load, to the sound of a laugh and a careless jest with a long-burnt block bell calls, and the big bull yank will swell her chest when the rigid signal falls. Over the metals hard and cold by Tokamaru swamp, she'll sing a song that is never old while a thundering drive is wrong. Mile on mile she'll race and haul, and the townships flitting by will hear the boast in her tuneful call that tells that his speed is high. You'll never feel the brakes shoot bite or the gaping buffers jar when the big bull yank has got you tight at the end of her coupling bar.